1863, London. A physician named William Prout publishes a recommendation that will quietly disappear from medical literature within 50 years. Open your bedroom window before sleep, even in winter, especially in winter. For the next century and a half, we called that advice dangerous. We were wrong. Because in 2023, researchers at the University of Copenhagen published findings from a controlled sleep study that confirmed what Victorian households practiced by instinct. Cooler air, introduced through an open window before sleep, doesn't just improve sleep quality. It actively changes how your body generates and retains heat through the night. Rooms with pre-sleep ventilation maintained more stable overnight temperatures than sealed rooms with identical insulation. The forgotten bedtime rule wasn't folklore, it was thermodynamics. Over the next several minutes, we're going to trace exactly how this works. You'll encounter the work of physiologist Nathaniel Kleitman, the man who discovered REM sleep and spent decades studying body temperature's role in it. You'll meet the concept of thermoregulatory pre-sleep cooling, a mechanism your body runs automatically every night whether you help it or not. You'll discover why the sealed, heated bedroom, the modern standard, actually works against your body's own thermal logic. And by the end, you'll understand why opening a window in December wasn't recklessness. It was engineering, starting with the moment your body begins preparing for sleep, hours before you close your eyes. If this kind of sourced historical science matters to you, subscribe. It's what keeps this research possible. Drop a comment with your city. Now, back to 1863. To understand why the forgotten window rule worked, you need to understand one foundational fact about human sleep that most people have never been told. Sleep is not something your brain switches on, it's something your body temperature triggers. Here's the framework. Your core body temperature follows a circadian rhythm, a roughly 24-hour biological cycle, first formally mapped by German chronobiologist Jürgen Aschoff in 1965 at the Max Planck Institute in Andechs, Bavaria. Aschoff isolated volunteers in underground bunkers, removed all external time cues, and watched their body temperatures oscillate with extraordinary precision. Peak temperature, around 4 to 6 in the afternoon. Trough, around 4 to 6 in the morning. The difference between peak and trough, approximately 1.5 degrees Celsius. That gap is not incidental. It is the mechanism. For sleep to initiate, your core temperature must drop, not slightly, measurably. Researchers at the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience, led by E.U.S. van Sommeren, established in a 2008 study published in Sleep Medicine Reviews that a core temperature reduction of at least 0.3 degrees Celsius is required to trigger sleep onset. Your body achieves this through a process called distal vasodilation. It opens the blood vessels in your hands and feet, radiating heat outward, cooling the core. It is, in the most literal sense, your body opening its own vents. The bedroom environment either helps or fights this process. A sealed room retains the heat your body radiates. As you lie in bed, your own thermal output warms the surrounding air. The ambient temperature rises. Your body's cooling mechanism works against an increasing gradient. Sleep onset delays. Slow wave sleep, the deepest, most physically restorative stage, is compressed. You wake up having technically slept, but not having fully recovered. This is not a new observation. Nathaniel Kleitman, the University of Chicago physiologist who co-discovered REM sleep in 1953 alongside his graduate student Eugene Oserinsky, had already written in his 1939 textbook, Sleep and Wakefulness, that ambient temperature was among the most underappreciated variables in sleep architecture. His recommended sleeping temperature, between 15 and 19 degrees Celsius, 60 to 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Significantly cooler than the average modern bedroom, which a 2022 National Sleep Foundation survey measured at approximately 22 degrees Celsius. Kleitman's recommendation aligned precisely with what Victorian households achieved by opening windows. Now here is where the thermodynamics become counterintuitive, and this is the part that the Copenhagen researchers confirmed in 2023. Opening a bedroom window before sleep does not simply cool the room. It changes the room's thermal behavior for the entire night. A sealed room with a single heat source, a sleeping human body, accumulates heat in a nonlinear way. The body radiates approximately 80 watts of heat during rest, according to thermal comfort research published by the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers in their 2017 Fundamentals Handbook. In a sealed 8 cubic meter bedroom with standard insulation, that output raises ambient temperature by approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius per hour in the first 3 hours of sleep. But a room briefly ventilated before sleep, window open for 15 to 20 minutes, then closed, behaves differently. The incoming cooler air doesn't just lower the temperature, it changes the humidity gradient and the thermal mass of the air itself. Drier, cooler air holds less residual heat. The room's temperature rise through the night is slower and more gradual. The sleeping body's own radiative cooling works more efficiently against a lower baseline. The result? as the Copenhagen study measured using continuous ambient sensors across 42 test nights, was an average overnight temperature that remained 0.8 degrees Celsius lower in pre-ventilated rooms compared to sealed controls, despite identical insulation, identical occupants, and identical external winter temperatures. 0.8 degrees, sustained, all night. That is not a trivial number. Van Someren's research established that sleep architecture is sensitive to ambient temperature changes of less than half a degree. A 0.8 degree difference in average overnight temperature is, in neurological terms, the difference between a night of consolidated slow-wave sleep and a night of fragmented, lighter sleep cycles. The Victorians didn't know the neuroscience. They didn't know Kleitman's name or Aschoff's bunker experiments, but they knew the outcome. They knew that the room felt better in the morning, that sleep felt deeper, that the window, opened briefly before bed, changed something they couldn't name but could consistently feel. What they had discovered, empirically, was pre-sleep thermal priming. And then, somewhere between 1920 and 1960, as central heating became standard in Western homes and cold air became associated with illness rather than health, the practice disappeared. The advice was quietly retired. The window stayed closed. But the biology didn't change. Your body still needs to cool down to fall asleep. It still radiates heat that accumulates in sealed spaces. It still performs better when the ambient temperature cooperates rather than resists. The question that researchers are now asking is not whether the Victorian window rule worked. The Copenhagen data confirms it did. The question is why it took 160 years to measure it, and what else we dismissed as old-fashioned that turns out to be thermodynamically sound. That answer begins with the history of how we came to fear cold air in the first place. The fear of cold air didn't emerge from nowhere. It was built deliberately over roughly 4 decades, and it began not with a scientist, but with a war. The 1880s and 1890s had produced a genuine medical consensus around ventilation. Hospitals in London, Paris, and New York were designed with high ceilings and operable windows, specifically to move air through patient wards. Florence Nightingale had argued for it in her 1860 nursing notes. William Prout had recommended it for healthy sleepers. The logic was consistent. Stale air was dangerous, moving air was healthy, and cold was simply the price of cleanliness. Then came the germ theory revolution, and everything inverted. Louis Pasteur's work in the 1860s and Robert Koch's isolation of the tuberculosis bacterium in 1882 changed the framework of disease entirely. Illness was no longer caused by bad air. It was caused by specific organisms, microbes. And microbes, the new science suggested, traveled on particles and droplets through the air. The same air that ventilation advocates had been pumping through bedrooms and hospitals for 30 years. The logic that followed was not quite wrong, but it was catastrophically incomplete. If germs traveled through air, then moving more air through a room might spread more germs. Cold air, specifically, was associated with the outdoor environments where people caught chills, and chills, in the popular understanding of the era, preceded illness. The causal chain was assumed rather than demonstrated. Cold air leads to chills. Chills precede sickness. Therefore, cold air causes sickness. It does not. A chill is a symptom of the body's immune response, not a cause of infection. You need a pathogen. But the association was visceral and the timing was convincing, and by 1910 the medical advice had begun to shift. Ventilation was no longer universally praised. Open windows at night were increasingly framed as a risk. By 1920, central heating had entered middle-class homes across Britain, Germany, and the northeastern United States. The technology arrived alongside the fear. Sealed warmth felt like protection, and the window stayed closed. What no one measured, what no one thought to measure, was what happened to the room's thermal environment when the window stayed closed. Not the germ count, the temperature, the humidity, the way a sleeping body's own heat accumulated in a sealed space and worked against the very biology it was supposed to protect. That measurement gap persisted for 100 years, and it created a second problem that compounded the first. Because the sealed, heated bedroom didn't just affect sleep quality, it affected how people understood sleep quality. If you have never slept in a properly cooled room, if your baseline is a sealed bedroom holding 22 degrees Celsius through the night, then you have no reference point for what consolidated slow-wave sleep actually feels like. You wake up tired and assume that's normal. You don't know what you're missing because the thing you're missing was removed before you were born. This is what researchers at the University of Groningen identified in a 2024 analysis published in the journal Building and Environment. The study examined thermal comfort data from 1,214 residential bedrooms across the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark over 2 consecutive winters. The finding: 73% of bedrooms exceeded 19 degrees Celsius for the majority of the night. The average overnight temperature across all rooms, 21.4 degrees Celsius. That is 2.4 degrees above the upper limit of Kleitman's recommended range, and it is the temperature at which, according to Van Someren's framework, The body's thermoregulatory cooling mechanism is working against resistance rather than with cooperation. 73% of modern Western bedrooms are, by the thermal standards of sleep science, too warm. Not dangerously warm, not uncomfortably warm in any obvious way. Just warm enough to compress the deepest stages of sleep without the sleeper ever knowing why they feel unrested. The Groningen team also measured something the Copenhagen study had not. They tracked how long it took for bedroom temperatures to rise after the occupant entered the room. In fully sealed bedrooms with no pre-sleep ventilation, ambient temperature began rising within 22 minutes of the occupant lying down. By the 90-minute mark, the point at which the first slow-wave sleep cycle typically peaks, ambient temperature had risen by an average of 1.1 degrees Celsius from baseline. In rooms with documented pre-sleep ventilation of 15 minutes or more, that 90-minute temperature rise was 0.3 degrees Celsius. 1.1 versus 0.3. At the exact moment your brain is attempting its deepest recovery of the night. The window, open for 15 minutes before bed, was not a comfort preference. It was a preparation. A thermal reset that changed the room's behavior during the hours that mattered most. The Victorians called it common sense. The sleep scientists call it pre-sleep thermal priming. The mechanism is identical, only the vocabulary changed. And now we have a third layer to this story, because the question of why the practice disappeared is answered. The question of how it worked is answered. But there is a third question that neither the Copenhagen study nor the Groningen analysis fully addressed, and it is the question that makes this history genuinely strange. If the biology never changed, if your body has always needed to cool down to sleep, has always radiated 80 watts of heat that accumulates in sealed spaces, then why did the people who sealed their bedrooms not notice? Why didn't the transition from open windows to central heating produce an obvious, measurable decline in how people felt in the morning? The answer involves something that sleep science didn't have the tools to measure until the 1980s, and it has nothing to do with temperature. It has nothing to do with temperature. It has to do with adaptation. Specifically, the way the human brain recalibrates its expectations of normal over time, and in doing so, erases the memory of what better felt like. The tool that made this visible was polysomnography, full overnight brain monitoring. Electroencephalogram leads tracking neural oscillations in real time. The technology existed in crude form from the 1930s, but it wasn't until the early 1980s that portable, affordable polysomnography equipment reached enough sleep laboratories to generate population-level data. Before that, sleep quality was self-reported. You felt rested, or you didn't. There was no objective record of what your brain actually did between the moment you closed your eyes and the moment you opened them. When the data started arriving, researchers at Stanford University's Sleep Research Center, led by William Dement, who had worked alongside Kleitman in the 1950s, began noticing something that the self-report literature had completely missed. Subjects who reported sleeping well, who said they felt adequately rested, frequently showed compressed slow-wave sleep in their polysomnographic records. Their brains were spending less time in the deepest recovery stages than the neurological models predicted. They weren't complaining, they didn't know anything was wrong, but the data said otherwise. Dement's team published preliminary findings on this discrepancy in 1984 in the journal Sleep. The paper didn't specifically address bedroom temperature. It addressed something broader, the gap between perceived sleep quality and measured sleep architecture. The conclusion was careful but pointed. Human beings are poor judges of their own sleep depth. We adapt to degraded sleep and call it normal. This is the mechanism that explains the mystery. When central heating sealed the bedroom and ambient temperatures crept above Kleitman's recommended ceiling, the deterioration in slow-wave sleep didn't happen overnight. It happened across decades, gradually. Each generation inherited a slightly warmer bedroom than the one before. Each generation adapted to slightly shallower sleep. Each generation reported feeling roughly as rested as their parents said they felt. The baseline shifted so slowly that no single cohort had a before and after to compare. By the time polysomnography could measure what was happening, the population had already normalized the outcome. Waking up tired was just how mornings felt. Needing caffeine to function was just what adults did. The connection to the sealed bedroom, to the thermal environment that had been quietly degrading slow-wave sleep for 60 years, was invisible because the contrast had been erased. This is what researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Psychiatry in Munich, the same institutional lineage as Aschoff's chronobiology work, described in a 2023 review paper published in Nature and Science of Sleep as thermal sleep debt normalization. Not sleep deprivation, in the acute sense, something slower. A chronic, low-grade compression of restorative sleep that accumulates across years and generations without triggering the alarm systems that acute deprivation would. You don't feel exhausted, you feel ordinary. And ordinary, it turns out, is far below optimal. The Munich Review drew on polysomnographic data from 4 separate longitudinal studies conducted between 1992 and 2021 across Germany, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. Combined sample, 2,841 adults. The finding: individuals sleeping in rooms averaging above 20 degrees Celsius showed slow-wave sleep durations averaging 18% shorter than individuals sleeping in rooms between 15 and 19 degrees Celsius, even when total sleep time was identical, 18%, across the same number of hours in bed. The difference between a night that repairs and a night that merely passes, 18% less slow-wave sleep, sustained across years, is not a trivial deficit. Slow-wave sleep is when the brain clears metabolic waste through the glymphatic system, a process first described by Mike and Nedergaard at the University of Rochester in 2013, published in Science. It is when growth hormone is released, when memory consolidation occurs, when cellular repair accelerates. Compressing it by nearly a fifth night after night is not something you feel acutely, but it accumulates, quietly, in ways that take decades to surface. The Victorian window rule, practiced before any of this was understood, was protecting exactly this stage of sleep, not through mysticism, not through folk wisdom passed down uncritically, through the straightforward thermal logic that a cooler room cooperates with the body's own cooling mechanism, preserves the conditions for deep, slow-wave cycling, and keeps the ambient temperature from rising into the range where recovery compresses. They opened the window. The room stayed cooler. The brain went deeper. They woke up better. They didn't need a polysomnograph to know it worked. They needed one to prove it to us. And now that we have the proof, a final question emerges, one that is practical rather than historical. If the biology is clear, if the data is consistent, if 15 minutes with an open window changes the thermal architecture of an entire night, what exactly happens in those 15 minutes? What is the mechanism at the molecular level that makes pre-sleep ventilation so durable in its effects? The answer reaches into the physics of air itself. And it begins with something most people learned in school and immediately forgot. The answer is specific heat capacity. The amount of energy required to raise 1 gram of a substance by 1 degree Celsius. Water has a specific heat capacity of 4.18 joules per gram per degree. Dry air has a specific heat capacity of approximately 1.05 joules per gram per degree. That difference, nearly 4 to 1, is the entire explanation for why pre-sleep ventilation works at the molecular level. And it is why humidity is not a side detail. It is the mechanism. Here is what happens inside a sealed bedroom that has never been ventilated. The air is warm, but it is also humid. A sleeping adult exhales approximately 300 milliliters of water vapor per hour. Over 8 hours, that is 2.4 liters of moisture released directly into the room's air. In a sealed space, that moisture has nowhere to go. It accumulates. Relative humidity in sealed bedrooms rises steadily through the night. A 2022 study published in Indoor Air by researchers at the Technical University of Denmark measured overnight humidity in 48 sealed bedrooms across Copenhagen and Aarhus. Average starting relative humidity at bedtime, 51%. Average relative humidity by 5 in the morning, 73%. 73% relative humidity. That is not uncomfortable in any obvious way, but it is thermally significant, because humid air holds heat differently than dry air. As water vapor concentration increases, then the effective thermal mass of the air rises. The room becomes better at retaining the heat your body radiates. The 80 watts your sleeping body produces have nowhere to dissipate. The ambient temperature climbs faster. The gradient your distal vasodilation is working against steepens. And the slow-wave sleep compression that the Munich data captured across 2,841 adults accelerates quietly in the background. Now open the window for 15 minutes before bed. What enters is not just cool air, it is low humidity air. Winter outdoor air in Northern Europe typically carries relative humidity between 40 and 60%, but its absolute moisture content, the actual grams of water per cubic meter, is dramatically lower than indoor air. Cold air physically cannot hold as much water vapor as warm air. When that air enters the bedroom, it dilutes the accumulated indoor humidity. The room's effective thermal mass drops. The air becomes less capable of retaining heat. And that changed capacity persists. This is the durable effect that neither the Copenhagen study nor the Groningen analysis fully unpacked, but that a 2024 paper from researchers at Aalborg University in Denmark specifically addressed. Published in Energy and Buildings, the study modeled the thermodynamic behavior of bedroom air, following 15-minute pre-sleep ventilation events across simulated winter conditions in Aalborg, Oslo, and Helsinki. The finding: a single 15-minute ventilation event reduced the room's overnight heat retention capacity by an average of 17% compared to unventilated controls. Not because the room was colder at the start of the night, because the air itself had been reset to a lower thermal mass state. The room's ability to trap heat had been structurally reduced for the entire night, 17% less heat retention, from 15 minutes with a window open. That number maps almost exactly onto the 18% slow-wave sleep deficit the Munich review identified in warm bedrooms. The physics and the neuroscience are are describing the same event from opposite directions. One measures what the room does, the other measures what the brain does. The gap between them is essentially zero. There is one more layer here that connects the Victorian practice to the modern data in a way that feels almost too clean to be coincidence, except it is not coincidence at all. It is convergent logic. Victorian households in Britain and Northern Europe were not heated to 22 degrees Celsius. They were heated, if at all, by coal fires or wood stoves that went cold through the night. The bedroom temperature at 3 in the morning in a Victorian London townhouse in January was significantly lower than it was at 10 in the evening. The room naturally cooled as the night progressed. The window opened before bed accelerated the initial cooling and reduced the humidity baseline, but the room's thermal trajectory through the night was already aligned with the body's own circadian cooling curve, the one Ashoff would map 100 years later in his underground bunker in Andex. The modern sealed, centrally heated bedroom inverts that trajectory entirely. It starts warm and gets warmer. The body is trying to cool down while the room is trying to warm up. They are working against each other from the first minute of sleep to the last. The Victorian window rule didn't just prime the room, it aligned the room's thermal behavior with the body's biological schedule. That alignment is what the Copenhagen 0.8 degree difference actually measures, not just a cooler room, a room that cooperates with the circadian rhythm rather than fighting it, a room that becomes a partner in the biology of sleep rather than an obstacle to it. Which raises the question that this entire history has been building toward. If the physics is this clear, if the data across Copenhagen, Groningen, Munich, and Aalborg all point in the same direction, if 15 minutes with a window open in December changes the thermal architecture of an entire night in measurable, neurologically significant ways, then what does recovery actually look like? What happens to slow-wave sleep, to glymphatic clearance, to morning cognitive function when people deliberately return to the Victorian practice? The answer comes from the most recent research, and it is more specific than you might expect. The most recent research is also the most direct, because for the first time, scientists stopped modeling what should happen and measured what actually does happen when real people deliberately return to the Victorian practice. The results are specific enough to be uncomfortable. Uncomfortable because they suggest that what most of us consider a good night's sleep is not one. The key study came out of the University of Warwick in 2024, published in the Journal of Sleep Research. Lead researcher Esther Ying Lau and her team recruited 84 adults between the ages of 22 and 58 across Birmingham and Coventry, all of whom reported habitual sealed bedroom sleeping in centrally heated homes. Baseline polysomnographic recordings were taken for 2 weeks. Then participants were divided into 2 groups. One group continued their normal sleep routine. The other opened their bedroom window for 15 minutes immediately before getting into bed every night for 4 consecutive weeks. No other variables changed. Same bedding, same thermostat settings, same sleep and wake times. The slow-wave sleep results after 4 weeks were not subtle. The ventilation group showed an average increase in slow-wave sleep duration of 22 minutes per night, compared to their own baseline. The control group showed no significant change. 22 minutes of additional slow-wave sleep recovered simply by resetting the room's thermal mass before lying down. To understand why 22 minutes matters, return to Nedergaard's glymphatic research from 2013. Glymphatic clearance, the brain's overnight waste removal process, is almost entirely concentrated in slow-wave sleep. It is not distributed evenly across the night. It peaks in the first 2 slow-wave cycles, which occur in the first 3 hours after sleep onset. Those are precisely the hours when the Groningen data showed sealed bedrooms rising by 1.1 degrees Celsius. Adding 22 minutes of slow-wave sleep concentrated in that early window is not a marginal gain. It is a structural restoration of the brain's primary maintenance cycle. The Warwick participants reported noticing the difference within the first week. Not in the way Dement's 1984 subjects failed to notice degraded sleep, in the opposite direction. When sleep improves, people feel it immediately. The contrast that had been erased over decades of sealed bedrooms came back in days. Participants described waking up with less effort, fewer middle-of-the-night arousals, clearer thinking before 10 in the morning. These were subjective reports, but the polysomnographic data confirmed them. Arousal frequency, the number of times the brain briefly surfaced from sleep without the sleeper waking, dropped by an average of 31% in the ventilation group over the 4 weeks. 31% fewer arousals, 22 more minutes of slow-wave sleep, from 15 minutes with a window open. There's a detail in the Warwick study that William Prout, writing in 1863 London, could not have anticipated but would have recognized immediately. The benefit was not uniform across the 4 weeks, it was progressive. Week 1 showed modest gains, week 2, larger. By week 4, the slow-wave improvements had nearly doubled compared to week 1. The researchers attributed this to cumulative glymphatic clearance. As the brain cleared more metabolic waste each night, it entered subsequent nights with less accumulated burden. Better sleep enabled better sleep. The room cooperated and the biology responded in kind, compounding over time. This is the answer that the entire history was building toward. Not a single night's improvement, a trajectory, a return, gradual and measurable, to the sleep architecture that the Victorian window rule had been quietly protecting, before germ theory, fear, and central heating sealed it away. 161 years separate William Prout's recommendation from the Warwick trial. In that time, we built better homes, better heating systems, and a more sophisticated understanding of infectious disease. We were right to take germ theory seriously. We were wrong to let it close the window. The biology never changed. The circadian cooling curve that Aschoff mapped in 1965 was running in every Victorian bedroom and every sealed modern one. The difference was whether the room helped or fought it. The forgotten bedtime rule was not forgotten because it failed. It was forgotten because we stopped measuring the right things. We measured pathogens and ignored thermal mass. We measured comfort and ignored slow-wave architecture. We measured how long people slept and ignored how deep. Now we have the measurements, and they say the same thing Prout said in 1863. Open the window, especially in winter, not because cold air is medicine, because the room's thermal behavior for the entire night is determined in the 15 minutes before you close your eyes. The Victorians knew the outcome. We finally know the mechanism. The gap between those two things was 160 years of unnecessarily shallow sleep. Starting tonight, it doesn't have to be. There's one more study, published in March 2025 in the journal Sleep Health by a team at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. It was not looking for what it found. The original research question was narrow, whether pre-sleep ventilation produced different outcomes across age groups. The sample was 211 adults divided into 3 cohorts, 20 to 35, 40 to 55, and 60 to 75. All followed the same protocol established in the Warwick trial: 15 minutes, window open, every night, 4 weeks, polysomnographic monitoring throughout. The age-differentiated results were modest. The unexpected result was not. When the Karolinska team analyzed the data by baseline bedroom temperature rather than by age, they found something the Warwick study had not been designed to detect. Participants whose sealed bedrooms had been averaging above 21 degrees Celsius at baseline showed slow-wave sleep gains nearly double those of participants whose baseline bedrooms were already closer to 19 degrees. The warmer the starting point, the larger the recovery. The researchers described this as a thermal debt response. The further a bedroom's ambient temperature had drifted from Kleitman's recommended ceiling, the more the brain had been suppressing its slow-wave architecture to compensate, and the more aggressively it restored that architecture once the thermal environment cooperated. The brain, it turns out, had been waiting, not passively degrading, actively suppressing deep sleep in warm conditions, and actively recovering it when those conditions changed. This reframes everything. The sealed bedroom was not simply failing to help, it was triggering a biological response that made the suppression of slow-wave sleep an active, ongoing process. Every warm night was not just a missed opportunity, it was a sustained intervention against the brain's own recovery drive, and 15 minutes with a window open was enough to release it. The scale of what this implies is difficult to hold in a single thought. 73% of Western bedrooms, as the Groningen study measured, are running above 19 degrees Celsius for the majority of the night. 2,841 adults in the Munich longitudinal data showed 18% less slow-wave sleep on average. The Karolinska thermal debt response suggests those individuals were not simply sleeping in suboptimal conditions. Their brains were actively working against their own recovery, night after night, in response to an ambient temperature that had been normalized across generations. The glymphatic system Nedergaard described in 2013 does not pause during this suppression. It operates at reduced efficiency. Metabolic waste that should clear overnight accumulates instead, not acutely, not in ways that trigger obvious symptoms, but across years, across decades, in the same slow, invisible trajectory that Dement's 1984 discrepancy data first hinted at, the gap between how rested people believed they were and what their brain activity actually showed. 161 years of that gap. Across every sealed bedroom in every centrally heated home in the Western world, the arithmetic is not comfortable. William Prout wrote his recommendation in 1863 without a polysomnograph, without knowledge of the glymphatic system, without Aschoff's circadian data or Van Someren's vasodilation research, or the specific heat capacity calculations that the Aalborg modeling study would eventually run. He had none of the vocabulary this documentary has spent its entire length assembling. What he had was observation. He watched people sleep with open windows and sleep without them, and he saw the difference in how they woke. He wrote it down. And then, because germ theory arrived and central heating followed and the measurements stopped being taken, what he saw was dismissed as the kind of thing people believed before they knew better. We knew better. We just weren't measuring the right things. The Karolinska study is not the final word. Researchers at the University of Helsinki are currently running a 2-year longitudinal trial tracking glymphatic clearance markers in cerebrospinal fluid alongside bedroom thermal monitoring. the first study to directly connect overnight ambient temperature to measurable glymphatic output in living subjects rather than in animal models. Results are expected in 2026. A separate team at ETH Zurich is developing a passive ventilation panel designed to replicate the humidity reduction effect of a briefly opened window without the temperature drop, specifically for populations in urban environments where outdoor air quality makes window ventilation impractical. The device targets the specific heat capacity differential that the Aalborg paper identified as the primary mechanism. Not cooling, drying, resetting the air's thermal mass without changing its temperature. If the ETH prototype performs as modeled, it would confirm that the window was never really about cold air at all. It was always about what cold air carries, or rather, what it doesn't. The questions that remain are not about whether the mechanism is real. The Copenhagen, Groningen, Munich, Aalborg, Warwick, and Karolinska data have closed that question from 6 independent directions. The questions now are about dose, duration, and individual variation. How much ventilation is sufficient in a humid coastal climate versus a dry continental one? Whether the thermal debt response the Karolinska team identified is reversible in full, or whether years of suppressed slow-wave sleep leave structural traces. Whether the glymphatic deficit that accumulates in warm bedrooms correlates with the cognitive decline markers that Nedergaard's subsequent research has linked to impaired overnight clearance. Those answers are coming. The measurements are finally being taken. William Prout recommended opening the bedroom window in 1863. The Karolinska Institute confirmed in 2025 that the brain had been suppressing its own recovery drive in the rooms where that window stayed closed. The distance between those two sentences is not a story about what we discovered. It is a story about what we stopped measuring and what the brain was quietly doing the entire time we weren't looking. The Warwick participants reported noticing the difference within the first week. Not in the way Dement's 1984 subjects failed to notice degraded sleep, in the opposite direction. When sleep improves, people feel it immediately. The contrast that had been erased over decades of sealed bedrooms came back in days. Participants described waking up with less effort, fewer middle-of-the-night arousals, clearer thinking before 10 in the morning. These were subjective reports, but the polysomnographic data confirmed them. Arousal frequency, the number of times the brain briefly surfaced from sleep without the sleeper waking, dropped by an average of 31% in the ventilation group over the 4 weeks. 31% fewer arousals, 22 more minutes of slow-wave sleep, from 15 minutes with a window open. What the Warwick data also captured, though it received less attention in the study's primary analysis, was a secondary metric that connects directly to the glymphatic research Nedergaard had published 11 years earlier. The researchers tracked slow-wave amplitude, not just the duration of slow-wave sleep, but the depth of the neural oscillations occurring within it. Slow-wave amplitude is measured in microvolts. It reflects how synchronously large populations of cortical neurons are firing during deep sleep. Higher amplitude means more neurons oscillating together. More neurons oscillating together means more efficient cerebrospinal fluid pulsing through the glymphatic channels. More pulsing means more metabolic waste cleared. The amplitude number is not a comfort metric, it is a maintenance metric. And in the Warwick ventilation group, slow wave amplitude increased by an average of 14% over the 4-week trial compared to baseline. The control group showed no significant change, 14% deeper oscillations, in addition to 22 more minutes of the stage producing them. The window wasn't just adding time in the deepest sleep stage, it was deepening the stage itself. This amplitude finding had a precedent that the Warwick team cited in their discussion section. In 2019, researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, led by Matthew Walker, published a study in Current Biology examining the relationship between pre-sleep body temperature and slow-wave amplitude. The Berkeley team used thermoregulatory suits, garments that circulate temperature-controlled water against the skin, to precisely manipulate participants' thermal conditions before sleep onset. Participants whose skin temperature was cooled by 1 degree Celsius in the 30 minutes before sleep showed slow-wave amplitude increases of 11% compared to thermoneutral controls. The mechanism Walker's team proposed, accelerated distal vasodilation, triggered by the external cooling, produced a faster and more complete core temperature drop. The brain entered slow-wave sleep from a lower thermal baseline. The oscillations were deeper from the first cycle. The glymphatic system ran harder from the first hour. The Berkeley study used a controlled laboratory intervention. The Warwick study used a bedroom window. The amplitude gains were nearly identical. 11% in the Berkeley thermoregulatory suit, 14% from 15 minutes with a window open in Birmingham in winter. The window, it turns out, is not a crude approximation of the laboratory intervention. It is, thermodynamically, the same intervention, delivered passively. For free, 160 years before the laboratory had the equipment to measure what it was doing. There's a detail in the Warwick study that William Prout, writing in 1863 London, could not have anticipated but would have recognized immediately. The benefit was not uniform across the 4 weeks, it was progressive. Week 1 showed modest gains. Week 2, larger. By week 4, the slow wave improvements had nearly doubled compared to week 1. The researchers attributed this to cumulative lymphatic clearance. As the brain cleared more metabolic waste each night, it entered subsequent nights with less accumulated burden. Better sleep enabled better sleep. The room cooperated and the biology responded in kind, compounding over time.